Have you ever wondered what came before China's first dynasty, the Xia dynasty? Well, in this video, I will talk about the mythical rulers of ancient China, the 3 Augusts and 5 emperors. It is unlikely that these people existed. Nevertheless, the narrative is very important because it tells us about how the Chinese people in the past made sense of their origin, and they are also considered by Confucius to be moral exemplars whose wisdoms and deeds we need to emulate. I am also laying the groundwork for us to understand Confucianism better in future episodes. As a bonus, I will also talk about how the Hmong, Vietnamese, and Korean mythical origins intersect with the Chinese. There are a few different roster lists for the 3 Augusts and 5 emperors. In some versions, Nuwa is not part of the list. The Yellow Emperor is bumped up to be one of the 3 Augusts, and his son, Sao Ho, is the first of the 5 emperors. But for this video, I will use the most commonly accepted version from Sima Qian's Record of the Grand Historian, the most influential history book in ancient China, and also the first book in the official 24 Histories of China. The section about the 3 Augusts was actually added later by Sima Zhen during the Tang Dynasty, but it still serves as a good reference point. Oh yeah, before we go forward, let me explain the term emperor used over here. As we know, Qin Shi Huang is usually called the first emperor of China, but more accurately, he was the first Huangdi, a title he invented by combining the term Huang and Di from the 3 Augusts and 5 emperors, San Huang Wu Di. I don't know why they are both translated into emperor, but I will just use the accepted translation to make it easier for everyone. The 3 Augusts are credited with the invention of many of China's cultures. They are the cultural heroes of ancient China, while the 5 emperors are people of outstanding moral virtue who ruled over a great era of peace. Confucius references them a lot in his text. Fuxi and Nuwa are the first 2 of the 3 Augusts. They were described to have human heads and snake bodies. In this record, they are depicted as kings who ruled in different time periods. But in other sources, such as Taiping Yulan, a book written 1,000 years later, we can find the version many people are more familiar with. They are often depicted as married brother and sisters, and was claimed to be the creator gods of Chinese people. Well, to be honest, it really was just Nuwa who did most of the job, molding humanity out of yellow earth. But as you can see, there are just a lot of contradictory accounts about these figures. But don't worry, I will address all this discrepancy later in the video. For now, let's just go with the orthodox narrative. The 3 Augusts. Fuxi, or the Fuxi clan, superseded Suiren, or the Suiren clan, and became king after heaven. He was credited with the invention of marriage, hunting, net fishing, bagua, and sacrifice to heaven. Nuwa, or the Nuwa clan's rule, came several generations after Fuxi's rule. In the last year of Nuwa's rule, Nuwa fought with the rebellious lord, Gonggong, who is known as the water god in other sources. Gonggong then also fought with Zhurong, who was known as the fire god in other sources. Gonggong was defeated, and in his anger, he broke the pillar of heaven. Nuwa then fixed the heaven with 5 colored stones and cut off the legs of a turtle, known in other sources as Aw, to create the 4 directions: north, south, east, and west. Sennong, or the Sennong clan, came after Nuwa. His name literally means God Farmer, and he was also known as Yan Di, the Flame Emperor. He had a man's body and a bull's head. He taught humanity farming, created farming tools, experimented with herbs by tasting them, and used it for medicine. He also created markets that allowed people to barter. As for the 5 emperors, this is where Sima Qian's original text started. The Yellow Emperor, or Huangdi, is known as the ancestor of all Chinese people. He was born a genius and grew up to be humble. By his generation, Sennong, or the Sennong clan's power, had waned. The dukes raided and harassed the people, and he couldn't do anything about it. So, the Yellow Emperor used weapons of war to punish them. After that, the lords started to pay homage to the Yellow Emperor instead, except for Ciyo, the fiercest one of them all. Seeing this turn of events, Sennong invaded the dukes. So then, the Yellow Emperor came to their defense. He controlled the 5 elements, cultivated 5 grains, trained bears, tigers, and other animals, and after 3 battles, he defeated Sennong at the Battle of Banquan. After that, Ciyou rebelled, and he was in turn captured and slain at the Battle of Zuolu. The Yellow Emperor then replaced Sennong as ruler, and he subdued those who would not submit. It is commonly claimed that the descendants of Sennong and Yellow Emperor intermixed and formed the Chinese people. That's why they often call themselves the descendants of Yan Huang. As for Ciyou's clan, some of them stayed and intermixed, while the others moved away to form the Miao or the Hmong minority group in China. The Hmong people actually have a different account of the legend, where the Yellow Emperor is depicted as the bad guy and Ciyou was the hero. But historically, Ciyou was also worshipped in China as a war god, even by Liu Bang, the first emperor of Han Dynasty. Some fringe theorists in Korea also claim that Ciyou or Chiwu was their ancestor. But it was based on Hwandan Gogi, a document that had been proven to be a forgery. Nevertheless, the idea stuck and can sometimes be seen in popular media. I will talk more about this shared myth later in the video. Huangdi was also commonly credited for creating traditional Chinese medicine and many other things. As I've said before, in another version, Cao Hao, the son of Yellow Emperor, was actually the first of the 5 emperors. But in Sima Qian's version, his relationship to the other emperors was unclear, although some scholars identified him as his eldest son, Xuanxiao. The Yellow Emperor had 2 sons, Xuanxiao and Changyi. The second of the 5 emperors was Changyi's son, Emperor Zhuanxu. Zhuanxu was calm, collected, and well-versed in all matters. He recorded the seasons, the movements of heavenly bodies, and expanded his rule further into the 4 directions. After he died, his cousin's son became the 3rd emperor, Emperor Ku. Again, Ku was born a genius. Yeah, they're all geniuses apparently. He was also selfless, thrifty, humane, fair, and dignified. He invented the calendar, and there was no one in the empire who did not respect him. He married 2 women. The first one bore him a son who would become Emperor Yao. But before Yao became an emperor, his brother Ji ruled before him. But Ji ruled poorly and died soon after. Yao was famous for being meritorious and benevolent. Him and the next emperor, Shun, is often used as the model of the perfect ruler by Confucius and many other Confucians after him. Yao brought harmony to his 9 degrees of Qin, and he employed people to the right position by meritocracy. He even refused to let his incompetent son hold office. It was also on his rule that China was starting to be plagued by floods, and he employed Gun, the father of Yu the Great, to control the floods. But after 9 years, Gun failed to accomplish his mission and became a pariah. Yu will try to control this flood much later. Yao, Sun, Yu are very important figures in Confucianism. What Confucius really admired about Yao was his commitment for meritocracy. Yao did not pass on the throne to his son, Danzu, who was unfit to rule, but he looked for the most suitable candidate instead. He was then informed of the existence of Sun, a distant relative from Zhuanxu's line. By then, he was just a commoner, and from a disreputable family to boot. His parents and brother behaved appallingly and even tried to kill him. But due to his filial piety, he was able to reform them. So Yao sent his 2 daughters to marry him and observed his behavior. He was impressed that Sun treated them with due ceremony, but Yao wasn't satisfied yet. After putting Sun through a series of tests which he passed brilliantly, Yao finally decided to give authority to his son-in-law, the most meritorious man, instead of his incompetent son. After Yao's death, Sun put Danzu on the throne and moved to the southern river. However, the dukes did not attend Danzu's court. They went to Sun instead. Singers also sang his praise instead of Danzu, so he took this as the will of heaven and returned to rule as emperor. As Yao valued meritocracy, so did Sun. Sun appointed Yu to control the floods that had been plaguing the empire since Yao's time. Yu worked tirelessly for 13 years, and he did not even visit his own family until his work was done. This is seen as a virtue by Confucians, but it also pretty much became the basis for toxic Asian work culture. After Yu succeeded in taming the floods, history repeated itself. Sun made Yu his minister, and after his death, the dukes ignored Sun's son and made Yu the ruler instead. And that's how the Xia, the first mythical Chinese dynasty, started. Actually, Yu also followed the tradition and gave the rulership to a minister. The minister then passed the throne to Yu's son, Qi. But as it turned out, Qi was more popular than the minister and he retained power. And that's how the dynasty became hereditary. Of course, since these events took place over 4,000 years ago, it is near impossible to prove them to be true. We have oracle bones that date back to the Shang dynasty that partially prove the dynasty's existence, but there are no archaeological evidence that corresponds with the Xia dynasty or the earlier emperors. There are plenty of prehistoric human settlements around China, such as the early Tao culture and the Longshan culture, which existed from around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. But there is no definite proof that these people are the citizens of the Xia dynasty. The problem is that these kind of prehistoric settlements are not very rare. There are just too many candidates, and the link between the narrative and the settlement still needed to be proven. Even Chinese historical skeptics from 100 years ago claimed that the 3 Augusts and 5 emperors are most likely euhemerized to fit a political narrative. Some of you may not be familiar with this term, but euhemerization is just the opposite of deification, which is the process of depicting a god as a historical human figure. Because in earlier accounts, the Yellow Emperor was worshipped as a god before he was depicted as a historical person. This euhemerization trend only started around the Warring States period, so it is very unlikely that these Augusts and emperors existed as historical people. This is why the Augusts and emperors are commonly considered to be mythical and legendary by modern historians. But even if they didn't exist, the narrative is still very powerful, especially when they are considered to be moral exemplars by Confucius. That's why various Confucian societies may want to draw a link to these legendary figures. In a later Vietnamese history book, Đại Việt史記全書, the first king of the Hubin dynasty, King Zhuang, was claimed to be a descendant of Shen Nong, the Yellow Emperor. Yao and Yu were also referenced in the introduction when explaining how the name Yue or Viet as in Vietnam originated. Kim Pusik, the Korean historian who wrote 삼국사기 during the Goryeo dynasty, also noticed that there are historical records that claim that the king of Silla claimed to be the descendant of Yellow Emperor's son, Sao Ho, and the Goryeo claimed to be descended from Emperor Ku. Rightfully, he was skeptical of this claim, but this kind of unsubstantiated connection were pretty common. The reason for this was probably because the Confucian classics were the subjects of imperial examinations, and virtually all scholars and historians in those countries were Confucian, so they probably claimed these connections to increase the prestige of their own dynasties. But there could also be other political motives too. Sima Qian claims that the Xiongnu are descended from Cunwei, a descendant of the Xia royal family. At the time, he was a part of the anti-war faction in Han Wudi's court, so he might have made that unsubstantiated connection to discourage war against the Xiongnu. The Confucians may not have been the ones who invented the 3 Augusts and 5 emperors narrative, but they certainly latched onto it hard. That's why even when an alternative narrative was presented, because the story of Yao, Sun and Yu may not have been as ideal as it was presented in the orthodox version. According to the legalist philosopher Han Fei, Sun usurped Yao, and in turn, Yu usurped Sun. So he suggested that there was actually a power struggle back then. There was also a document called the Bamboo Annals, which was buried in the tomb of King Xiang of Wei before Qin Shi Huang unified China and burned the ancient history books en masse. The document was discovered almost 600 years later in the Qin Dynasty. According to the Bamboo Annals, Sun imprisoned Yao and prevented Yao's son, Danzu, from seeing his father. So it goes completely against Confucius' narrative. The ancient world may not have been as utopian as he claimed after all, and it was probably realpolitik all the way back. However, there are also issues with this document, because scholars notice that during the Ming and Qing dynasty, the content seemed to have changed, so the modern text of this document may have been altered. Additionally, just because an alternative account exists, it doesn't mean that it had to be true, since we are talking about legendary figures after all. It just means that an alternative account exists and it also needs to be proven to be true. Anyway, now that we have got this topic out of the way, I can talk about Confucianism on the next episode. So if you don't want to miss it, then subscribe. If you like what we are doing, then you can also support us on Patreon. Until next time, stay cool, my bros.